Hello and welcome to Fusion 360 for Woodworking. My name is Ben Weiss, and I believe this is the first time that Fusion has been taught at Yestermorrow. I've been teaching SketchUp at Yestermorrow for several years now, and the last couple of years I've kind of switched over to Fusion. It's a much more capable program in many respects and much more complicated program in many respects. So I kind of want to get some disclaimers out of the way early here. Like I said, Fusion is a complicated program and it can be frustrating, but I hope to get you over some of those frustrations that I ran into initially. Um, Fusion does assume that you have a good deal of computer experience. Um, Hopefully you do. The success in Fusion 360 really requires experimentation on the user's part and ongoing education. There are tons of YouTube videos on particular things in Fusion. I would encourage you to continue watching videos after this class. If you come from a SketchUp background like I do, you kind of have to let go of some of those methodologies and try new approaches. Um, I think Fusion 360 is all about making mistakes and understanding what went wrong and fixing them. So I would suggest that you go slow and that you observe what's happening on the screen. And this is the first time I've taught Fusion, but I am hopefully, hopefully we'll do a good job with this. So anyway, my goals in the class are for you to learn how to problem solve in Fusion, for you to know after this class when to use Fusion versus some other programs that you may have used for design such as SketchUp. I want to expose you to all of the most important features in Fusion and hopefully get you hooked on it like me. So the structure of the course, basically before each session, I would like you to watch the video. For instance, this is the video for session one. So, after our online session, I'd like you to watch the video. Hopefully you'll learn new concepts there and practice those on your own. And also, each of these videos at the end will have various assignments for you to do. And please get those assignments done before the next session. And it'd be great if you could take some notes and discuss with the rest of the class your successes and failures as you did your assignment. So at the beginning of next class, each student will be able to present their assignments and share that information with others. And then after that, in subsequent classes, I will demonstrate the new topics, but please interrupt me if you have any questions at any time. And also, if you do miss a class, these videos will go into probably more depth than the class does, so you should be okay. Okay, so we're going to continue with an overview of the Fusion 360 interface. The first thing I'm going to show you are the workspaces. So this big button in the upper left says Design. If I pull that down, I can go to several different workspaces, rendering, animation, etc. Really, the only two we're going to get into in detail are Design, which are your CAD designs, your modeling, and Drawing, which lets you create printouts, printed measured drawings of your design. And if we have time, we may get into the render section. But for the most part, we will be in design. Second thing I want to show you is the data panel. So if I click on this icon in the upper left, I see a number of projects that I've already got in here. If you're just starting out and haven't saved any projects, I think you'll probably see libraries and samples down here and not see any projects. But you can create a new project, which I will do right now by clicking on New Project. And I'll type in Fusion 360 Woodworking. So that's the project that I'm going to put all the class files in. I suggest you set up a similar project. Okay, so if I double click on that Fusion project, you'll see that I don't have any files listed yet. Okay, so I'm going to close down. Actually, I'm going to go to the Home button here, take us back, and let me do this. I'm going to scroll this bar down and show you something that concerned me when I first started Fusion. I had created a bunch of files, and then I went back to try to find my project. So I'm going to open up the data panel, and I didn't see my project anymore. And I thought that something got lost in the cloud and my projects were gone. I didn't realize that there's a scroll bar here. And I didn't realize that basically Fusion doesn't scroll this automatically to the top when you open this up. It's going to stay in whatever position you're in. So if I show Woodworking as my top project, I close the data panel, open the data panel back up, Woodworking is right there. So the scroll bar is going to stay put, which makes sense, but I didn't know there was a scroll bar. So anyway, that kind of burned me initially. All right, so next I'll get into navigation. So in order to do that, I really need to open a model. So I'm going to go back to my data panel. I'm going to go to one of my models here under Woodworking, Shelves. I'm going to open up Basement Office Shelves and close my data panel. So now I've got a model on the screen, and there's several ways that I can navigate, most importantly with the mouse. So if I hold down the middle mouse button and move my mouse, you can see I'm panning. I can go up, down, left, right. If I hold the shift key down first and then hold down the middle mouse button, I can orbit. And if I simply turn the mouse wheel in or out, I can zoom in or out. Now, another thing that threw me when I started Fusion was this zooming was working opposite of what I anticipated, opposite of what, for instance, SketchUp does. So there is a setting in your preferences. You can get to your preferences by clicking in the upper right where your name is, go down to preferences, and then when that pops up, I'm in the top screen here, general. I'll go down, and I've already done this, but if that zoom direction is bothering you, you can check this or uncheck it to flip the zoom direction, and then do an apply, and then do an OK. So I'll just cancel out of that. Okay, so that's the primary way of navigating a model. Again, middle mouse button down, you can pan, hold shift down first, and then hold down the middle mouse button. You can orbit or zoom in and out with the mouse wheel. Okay, there's also this view cube in the upper right corner. And with my left mouse button, I can drag that and kind of orbit around, repositioning the zoom cube. But you can see it's a little difficult to do that. And there's really no reason to do that because I can, easier to do it using the mouse and the shift key to orbit. But the thing I do use the view cube for is if I want a straight on view, an elevation, I can click on front. If I want a top elevation, I'll use this little button right here and I'll go there. And you can spin this around to your heart's content, going from, straight on view to straight on view. Now, if you want to return to your perspective view, you can click on the home button in the upper left corner of the view cube. Now, one of the things I would suggest doing is using a camera setting of perspective with ortho faces. So what that means is if you're looking straight on, you're going to get an orthographic. But if you're looking on a perspective like we are now, you're going to get some perspective. So let me turn perspective on and go to my front view. And you can see here, I'm getting some perspective here. And I don't generally want that if I'm in one of these straight on views. So that's why I set this to a camera setting of perspective with ortho faces. So now I'm getting orthographic. If I orbit a little bit, now I'm getting a perspective view. So that's a great feature. Doesn't exist in SketchUp, but I would highly recommend you do that. Okay, so that is the data panel. We've done some navigation. We've looked at the workspaces real quickly. Now let's look at the document tabs up here. Basically, I've got one document open. If I go to my data panel, go back to woodworking, let me pick another. I'll go to workbench, and I'm going to open up this Rubo bench. Takes a second. By the way, all of these files are located in the cloud, so if you've got a complex design, sometimes it'll take a little bit to download it. I'm going to close this. This is a workbench that I built recently from a plan, and I took the plan and I just inputted stuff into Fusion just to get a better idea of how some of these parts work and interact. But now you can see I've got two documents open. I can click over here to go to this one, click over here to go to that one. And if I want to create a new document, I can either click on this plus here, or I can go to my file menu and do a new design there. So lots of different ways to do the same thing in this program, but I'll try to use what I think is the most common and easiest method. Okay, so toolbars. That's this bar across the top, and you can see that I'm in the solid toolbar. If I click here in the surface toolbar, I get a whole new set of icons. There's mesh, there's sheet metal, and then there's some tools here. We will primarily be in solid. I may show you a little bit of surfacing, but that's kind of advanced. Mesh is when you bring in somebody else's model and you want to use it. Sheet metal is for parts that you fold, so we won't be getting into that at all. So for the most part, we will be in this solid tab and have this set of tools on our screen. Okay, so within this solid tab, we've got pull-down menus for create, modify, assemble, construct, inspect, insert, and select. And on the right hand side, this will change kind of based on what you're doing. Once we get into sketches, you'll see that this will turn into finished sketch here. So beware of that. You can set these limited number of creation icons any way you like. I'm not going to get into that right now, but just beware that all of them exist in this pull down menu. But the stuff that you use often, like extrude, it's right here so that you can just click on it. There are also hotkeys, and you'll see that the E is listed next to the extrude. You can set those up to your desire too. So create is basically when you are creating either 3D geometry, or when you're in a sketch, when you're creating different parts of the sketch. Modify is when you're combining things or cutting joinery or working on existing bodies. Assemble is, we will get into this a little bit, but you can actually put things together and actually have hinges that move, and you will find all of that in assemble. Construct are basically construction planes that allow you to basically, when you do your sketching, which we'll get into shortly, you have to sketch on a plane. The origin is accessible, the origin on your model, so you can always sketch on that. But sometimes there's an odd angle you want to sketch on. First, you would create some type of plane to do that, and then sketch on top of that plane. So that's what this construction menu is all about. Inspect allows you to measure primarily, but there's some other things. For instance, you can show different components in different colors. That's something that I use often. Insert allows you to insert an existing drawing and kind of trace over it, amongst other things. So that is, we'll get into depth in all of the important features there, but just wanted to show you that basically you've got these icons on your screen. You've also got pull down menus that are complete for all of the creation features, and you have shortcut keys. So again, many ways to do the same thing. Okay, so I'm going to get into a couple other preferences here that will be handy for us. Let me go back to our office shells. You will see in any file you have, the very first thing is document settings. You'll see that in this workbench as well. So if we open up document settings in this, what's called a browser, it's basically just a tree. If I open that up, you'll see there's a units, and if I double click on that, oops, if I double click here, sorry, I think that's ending up off my screen. Oh, there it is. Okay. So you have to double click on this little guy right here to change your units. And now a dialog box pops up that's docked to the right hand portion of the screen, and it's allowing me to select millimeters, meters, centimeters, foot, inches. I think you probably, when you start up Fusion, you will default to millimeters. So if you want to go ahead and change that to inch, I think we'll primarily be working in inches. The second thing that you should do is to go to your preferences. So I clicked on my little BW circle here. And when I go to preferences, if I go down to my unit and value display and click on that, you will see that in foot and inch display format, I've got fractional. So instead of inch and a half showing up as 1.5, it's going to show up as 1/2, which is what, well, it's just primarily what you want for woodworking, at least I do. So anyway, beware of that. If you want to change that, that's what I'll be using. Let's see, are there any other preferences? Okay, I do turn off my grid layout. If I turn that on, you'll see you have a grid. But the grid will also come on when you're doing sketching, which is, in my mind, the time that you want the grid. I don't really want it here. So if I go down here and turn grid layoff off, you won't have it when you're just viewing your model. Okay, so let me show you very quickly one other way to navigate. I have on my desktop a little device. I don't know if you can see it in the camera here, hopefully. It's called a 3D connection, and it's just like a knob, but it's specifically made for CAD, so that I can hold this knob with my left hand and pull it in and out and turn it, and basically just maneuver this knob any way I like, and it's super intuitive where I can quickly and easily navigate this model. Certainly not something you have to have, but if you end up doing a lot of CAD modeling, the nice thing here is I can keep my right hand on the mouse and not have to use that for navigation. I can use that only for selecting, menu items, and then use my left hand for very quick and smooth navigation. So it's out there if you want to take a look at it. All right, but certainly not necessary. All right, so moving on to feature dialogues. What I mean by that is if I was to, let's see, I will do a quick extrusion here. So I'm going to click on a surface, and then I'm going to go up to Create and select Extrude. Okay, now I have a dialog box up on the screen that says Extrude, and it has lots of settings in it. That's what I mean by a feature dialog. So any feature that you do, whether it's an extrusion or a loft or a sweep or whatever, will have its own feature dialog box. And once these are up, you pretty much either have to cancel out of it or select all these settings and do an OK. For instance, I can pull this up, and you'll see that the distance here is being set, and I've got an operation that's join or cut or intersect. I'll get into that in depth, but if I click OK, then the feature dialog box is gone. Then I can do other things. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. Okay, now to go back there and do that again, this time I'm going to hit the E key, which is my extrude shortcut. I just want to show you that you can move this feature dialog box around, and it does have a tendency to get in the way of what you're doing, but you can always pan your model away from it. I like to leave it here on the right hand corner of the screen, and if you do experiment with this and you want it back here in this area, all you do is drag this. I see how I'm getting a green bar highlight, and then let go of it. That docks it on this right hand side of the screen. I'm not sure if you can dock in other spots. Let me see if I can. Here I can dock it left, but just see it moved the browser over. So I'm going to go back over here. Okay, so these are what they call feature dialogues. I'm going to cancel out of that. Now, one of the things that, I think takes some getting used to, coming from SketchUp, for instance, is that, you do an extrude and you think you're done. And then you try to go off here and do something else. Well, in that case, that finished my extrusion. I was about to say you won't be able to do it. Sometimes when a feature dialog box is up, you can't do something else. You have to finish that feature. So just be aware of that. Okay, that's feature dialogs. Oh, one other thing in feature dialogs is, again, I will do an extrude. This blue setting, beware of that, because that is basically, you can set any of these in any order you want, but Fusion is telling you with a blue highlight, this is what you really should be doing next. So for instance, I can kill my selection, and it's saying, well, you better select something to extrude. So I can go down and select that. And then once I'm done with that, I can handle the other settings. So the blue area is generally just a suggestion by Fusion that this is either the next thing you should do or the most important thing you should do within this feature. So let me dock my feature. Let me cancel to get out of there. Okay, so let's see what we haven't gone over here. Navigation, preferences. I feel like, oh, I'm missing the browser. The browser is basically a tree structure, and you can open things up by clicking on this little triangle. You can see that sometimes there are multiple levels of features and other items to open up here. A lot of this gets set up automatically by Fusion, and some of it's stuff that you set up. So this is your file at the very top. Then you have your document settings, which we changed to inches. I'm going to close that up. And then you have named views, which are exactly the same as this in the view cube. So if I click on front, it's going to scroll to the front. Named views allows you to basically set up your own view. So if I want, well, for whatever reason, I want to be in this particular view, I can go over here to name views, and if I right click on it and I select a new named view, and I'm going to say, I'm going to rename this. Now, renaming in the browser is a little funky. I don't like the way it works, but they didn't ask me. So I'm going to click on it, and now I can rename it. But sometimes well, not sometimes. First you have to select it, then click on it a second time. Well, in this case, see, it's being really funky. I've got to click on it. I'm having trouble here renaming. Okay, let me see if I can do it here. All right, I'm going to click off of it, click on it, click a second time. Okay, all right, double clicked on it. All right, so you may have to experiment a little bit to your liking to see how to rename these, but I highly suggest you do. So I'm going to say from bottom. And now I've created a view. So if I go to top and I click on from bottom, if I click on this portion of from bottom, that's going to navigate. If I click on this portion, sometimes it's going to rename. Okay, I will show you renaming in another area that I think works a little bit more predictably. So I'm going to close up my name views. Then I have my origin. This is the origin for the entire model. And we'll get into strategies on where you want to start your sketches relative to this origin, which can really help you. But that can be always viewed or it can be hidden. So if I just click on the little eyeball, I'm hiding my origin. Okay, so then I've got a series of what are called components. And if I click here in the browser, you'll see also over here in the model space, I get a blue highlight. So that's left shelf 1. This is, oh, I think L for lower. So this is lower shelf 1. This is lower shelf 2. And you'll see a little bit of difference here. You'll see shelf :1, shelf :2. That means these are identical components, and this is the second instance, and this is the first instance. But we'll get into that also. Now here's my divider, my large divider, my second instance of the large divider. Again, these are all components. And now I've got the small shelf and my small divider. Okay, so these are all components. If I am to open up any of those, well, first off, let me close it. I can hide any one of those. So here I'm hiding one of those dividers. I'm hiding another one here. All right. I can also open up that and I see a bunch of stuff underneath there. So I can show each one of these dividers origin, and I can show all of the bodies that make this up, and also all of the sketches that make that up. So basically, sketches are 2D drawings that you will do that basically define your parts. And then, for instance, you can do an extrude to make it into a 3D body. So that's the difference between sketches and bodies. But we'll go into that in much more detail. Another thing in the browser is there's always one active component, and you can see that has the little fisheye selected. If the top level is selected, you will see the entire model. And now I'm gonna hide these sketches, and I'm gonna hide the origin. So let's see. We want to find something in the browser. I want to find this origin. So I click on it, and now I see a little squiggle underline. So that shows me it's in this large divider. So if I open up the large divider and I go to my origin and hide it, boom, it's hidden. Now you still see a blue selection. So if I click outside that blue selection, that's gone. That's just telling you it's still selected, but it's hidden. So you just click away from it and it'll be gone. Now the same thing here. I've got a sketch and I don't want that showing. It's really not part of my 3D model. So if I click on this and then right click and find in browser, where is that? So it's also in my large divider component, and now sketches opens up and it shows this sketch. So I'm just going to hide all the sketches in that component, and now I'm good. Okay, so if I go down here and say, okay, I only want the short shelf, which is this one right here. I only want that. I only want to work on that. Okay, I'm sorry, the short shelf is this horizontal piece. You see how that is not highlighted, but everything else is dimmed. So that means, okay, you have this component open, and if you create sketches or create additional bodies, they're going to go inside that component, which is essential for keeping your design basically in order. So you really, in the browser, should always be conscious, am I in the entire model, which I am here, or am I in a particular component? And when you're in a particular component, you will see that. Now, if the rest of that stuff, if you don't want to see the rest of the components within this model, another thing you can do is I can right click on this and go to isolate. And now the shelf, the large shelf, is the only thing that shows up on the screen because I've isolated it. If I want to unisolate it, I can right click and go to unisolate. Another way of doing that, if I undo one level here, is to go up to the office shelves, the entire file basically, and I can right click and say unisolate all. And now I've still got this shelf as the active component, but all the rest of the components are also shown. If I want to see everything, the way we saw it initially when we opened up the file, I can just activate that top level component, basically the file name, and now I see all the parts. So that is the browser. We will get into a lot more of that as we use it. It's essential. You use it all the time. This thing down here is very interesting. This is the timeline. So basically, based on which component is active, and I've got our top level component active, I see a timeline of all of the operations involved in creating this model. And I can take this, I can either use these little fast forward, rewind buttons, or I can actually scrub this by pulling this back. And now I'm at the beginning of time for this shelf. And I can go one operation at a time. And this is, I can kind of describe what's going on here, but I created a component and then I created a sketch. The reason you see nothing on the screen is the sketch for this shelf is hidden. If I was to show it, you'll see that. Then the next step is I did an extrude, and the next step, I actually copied this to make a second instance. So now we have two shelves. And if I go right forward again, I'm creating a new component. There's nothing in it right now. Then I create a sketch. Again, that sketch is hidden. So if I go to this divider, I can turn that sketch on. And then I'll go forward again here. I did the extrusion for that. And a second extrusion, which fixed a little problem that I left behind. Anyway, go forward here. Created another copy of that. Now here's a new component. I'm now doing a sketch that is, again is hidden. Let's see if we can go up here and show all sketches. Is that a feature? Nope, appears like it's not. Anyway, let's say I want to find this sketch. It's like, where the hell is this sketch? It's somewhere in this browser. And the easiest way to do that is I can right click and say find in browser. Now it opens up the small shelf and it opened up sketches, and now I can show all the sketches, and there it is. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but you can see if I take this to the end, it's showing you basically all of the design history. Let's see if I right click here. Can I hide all sketches? No, that would be a good feature to have. So basically now that I have these sketches showing, I'd have to open up the component. And so easiest way to deal with this is to click on it. You will see, okay, there it is. It's blue highlighted. I'm just going to hide all my sketches for that and then collapse that component. This component has sketches it's showing. If I click on that, any of that sketch geometry, I'm seeing that this large shelf is highlighted. I open that up, I hide those sketches. Now you see there's two sets of sketches hid because these two components are identical. So if I do something in one of them, you'll see that, like I turned the origin on, it not only turned on in the second instance, but it also turned on in the first instance. So I'm going to hide origins in one of them. They both hide. Okay, so that is the timeline and browser. You can find things when you're in the timeline and the browser. You can also do the reverse of that. If I'm down here in this sketch and I want to see where is this in my timeline, I can right click and say find in timeline, and then I've got a highlight over where it exists in the timeline. So we will get into editing the timeline because that's the purpose of this. This is essentially parametric design, and I can go back in any of these things without undoing everything and make changes to a sketch that I did a long time ago, and then everything replays and the model will update itself. So it's really very cool once you get used to that. All right, so that's kind of an intro to the timeline, intro to the browser. And the next thing we will do is to get into sketches. Let's get into sketches now, which are very important in Fusion 360. Basically, sketches allow you to draw on any 2D surface or plane, and you can draw a series of arcs, lines, points, splines, any kind of 2D geometry. And then you generally use that 2D geometry to make a solid body, either extruding it or doing lofts between a couple of sketches, that type of thing. So let's see what happens when we first create a sketch. So I'm in a new document here. If I simply click on Create Sketch, I'm presented with the origin and 3 planes that I can select. And as I hover over these 3 planes, you can see the grid becomes parallel with that plane. So anyway, let me pick one of those. And now you see that the screen oriented to look straight down on it. And you can also see over here in your browser, if I open up the Sketches folder, a sketch 1 was created and automatically named. Okay, so I'm just going to do a finish sketch and show you that the screen goes back to its normal view if we look at the view cube. So let me undo that, and I just want to undoing a couple of times so the sketch is gone. I just want you to look this time when I create it as what happens to the view cube. So I'm clicking on Create Sketch. I'm presented with 3 planes to select. I'm going to select this ground plane. And now the view cube says top. It's looking straight down at it. And I know I'm in sketch mode for several reasons. One, there's a new button here that says Finish Sketch. Second reason is there's a sketch palette dialog box that popped up. And the third reason is this sketch tab, which normally doesn't exist, is highlighted. And there's a new set of create and modify tools and new menus. So there's nothing in here to create 3D bodies. This is all now commands to create 2D geometry. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to pick a 3-point rectangle. And basically that allows me to start in one point, move to a second, and move to a third to define the geometry I want. Okay, so now I have created a sketch, and let's say I want to say that's all I want to do inside the sketch. I can click on this green check mark. Over here in the sketches folder, I can hide that sketch or show that sketch. I can also double click right here, which is going to allow me to edit that sketch. I'm back in that sketch and I can make any changes I want here. If I want to drag this rectangle in a little bit, I can do so. Okay, so one of the things you might see here is I've got a couple of black lines and I've got a couple of blue lines. The black lines are what Fusion considers as fully defined, and they coach you to always have fully defined sketches. Basically what that means is that every piece of geometry in your sketch is either dimensioned, here I'm putting 4 inches in, or it's constrained with these little constraints, they call them. For instance, here's one right here. If I hover over that, if I click on it and we go down to the bottom right corner of the screen, we will see that that's a parallel constraint. If I click on this one, it says that it's a perpendicular constraint. So these little icons pop up showing you what constraints were automatically added to the geometry as I was drawing. But another thing you can do Let's just start drawing some lines. If I draw a line here, and I'm going to hit the check mark, so I got out of the line tool. And if I hit escape, I'm just in basically my selection. So I can take this point and I can move it anywhere I want. I can take this point, move it around, and I can take the line and move it around. The reason I can do that is the sketch is not constrained. So I can start putting constraints on here. Let's say I want this line to be vertical. I can click on with it selected, I can click on the horizontal vertical constraint, and now this little icon pops up which says it's always going to be vertical. So if I hit escape to go back to my selection, now when I move these points or drag this line, I can still move it, but I can't change the fact that it's vertical. So it's constrained to stay vertical. Now, if I also do something like a coincident, I've got this point, it's selected, I click on coincident and I click on the origin. Now the line moves to the origin. So there's two constraints on this line right now. Basically, this line always has to intersect the origin, and that's what these coincident icons are showing, and it's always got to be vertical. So I should be able to change the height of it, which I can do, but I cannot, and I can flip the direction it's going in, but I can't change the angle, I can't move it around. It's always vertical because of this constraint, and it's always, the top point is always at the origin because of that constraint. So that's what constraints are all about. You don't have to use them, but it is handy to use them. It prevents mistakes, and it also aids in parametric modeling, which we'll get into more detail in the next class. Okay, so let me do another type of rectangle. This one is a centered rectangle, and if I click in the origin, now as I move out, you can see I've got a dimension on the top, which says 41.5 some odd inches, and it's highlighted. So I can type in, let me type in 40 and hit the tab key, and now it goes to the second dimension, and I'm going to say 20 and press enter, and I have a 20 by 40 rectangle, and it's also centered in the middle of the screen. So now this entire rectangle went black because it means it's fully constrained. If I grab any portion of this rectangle, any of the points or edges, I can't move it. And these dotted lines are called called construction lines. And basically the way this stays centered is Fusion automatically drew these two construction lines and set a coincident constraint to the center of the origin. So these dimensions we typed in, so this box is going to stay 40 inches by 20 inches, but we can double click on that dimension and change it to anything we like at any time. So we can finish this sketch. Now we're back in our original view. I'm going to do an extrude, which allows me to stretch this up like a push-pull in SketchUp, and click OK. And if I ever want to change this box, you can start extruding these different sides, but you really don't want to do that. You want to go back to your timeline and right-click on the sketch, edit the sketch, change the dimension. I'll change this to 40. Well, let me change it to 50. And then we should have a cube when I get out of here, although I haven't changed the height. I'm sorry, we have a square, kind of like a 2x piece of wood. And we'll see that we can also change these features. I can edit a feature and go in, and let's say I want that to be 50 inches as well. That's changing the height of my extrusion. So at any time during the modeling process, I can go back to a particular sketch, right click on it in the timeline, Or I can double click here, same thing. That will get me into the sketch. Or I can double click there or right click and edit sketch. Okay. So one of the things you will see is that your sketches often will become hidden after you create your 3D body. And that's controlled over here. Fusion does that as a convenience to you to go ahead and hide your sketch automatically, thinking that you're done making your solid body, so you no longer want to see your sketch. Sometimes that's what you want, sometimes it's not. So just be aware that you can come over here and manually turn your sketch on. Very similar to the way we can turn bodies on and off. If I turn this body off, now we can see the sketch that was sort of partially hidden on the bottom of this body. Okay, so we're not limited to, when creating a sketch, we're not limited to just those three surfaces. If I want to create another sketch now, I'll click on this Create Sketch button. I can now select any of the surfaces in my model, in a 3D body in the model. Let's say I click on this bottom right here. So watch what's going to happen. Watch the view cube and see how that's going to orient, and watch the rest of the model. So when I click here, Fusion automatically orbited the model, and we're looking at the bottom because that's where I said I wanted the sketch to appear. Now you don't have to do your sketches looking straight at it. For instance, I'm going to do, let me do an arc, and a 3-point arc. I'll start somewhere here and go here and create my arc. And you see that arc appeared on the bottom of this body because this is the sketch plane that we're sketching on. If I ever get off axis where we're not straight on looking at it, I can come over to the sketch palette and click on Look At, and that will give me that bottom view. I could also manually orbit there, or better yet, use my view cube to get there. So you are drawing 2D geometry, but you're drawing it somewhere in 3D space, and that 3D space is defined by the plane that you clicked on. Now I don't have to draw directly on this object. If I drew out here somewhere and did another circle, you will see, if we can orient this properly, that this circle is on the same plane as the first circle I drew. So I'll hide the body so you can see that better. So anything I draw while I'm in this sketch is always going to be on the same plane as the sketch that, as the plane that we selected when getting into the sketch. And again, you know you're in a sketch in this case because I've got a grid, I've got a Finish Sketch button, I've got a sketch palette, I've got this sketch tab up here, and I've got particular tools that are particular to making 2D geometry in the sketch. Okay, so that's a basic intro to sketching. Now, let's see. Dimensioning and constraining we went over kind of briefly. Let's say we want to go back into this sketch. We've got two sketches now. And so in this timeline, let's say we go back to the first sketch. If I right click and edit this first sketch, watch what happens. The circles are gone. Now, when that first happened to me, I thought, something's wrong, or I did something wrong. Why are my circles gone? Well, what you have to realize is you've gone back in time. You are editing the sketch, and you're going back to the point where the sketch was defined in the timeline. So those circles do not exist yet in the model. But let's say we wanted to reference those circles because we want to draw lines from those circles to this rectangle. There is a solution for that. I'm going to finish my sketch, and now I'm going to take this sketch and drag it on the timeline. See if I can do that. Well, let me try an alternative. I'm going to drag the second sketch, which is the one with the circles, and I'm going to drag that to the left, and that's as far as I can go. But sometimes you're able to drag a sketch and put it in the spot you want. So now if I edit the second sketch by doing an edit sketch, you can see I've got my rectangle to reference. So it's kind of a poor example, but what I'm trying to say here is you can go back and edit these sketches, but when you do, you are rewound in time. So you may not see some bodies and other sketches that you thought you should be seeing. Okay, so let's get into naming sketches. I generally don't name sketches if I only have one in a folder. But if I start to have multiple sketches, it's a really good idea, especially if in a complicated model and you want to come back and change, for instance, the diameter of this circle. You want to know what sketch that circle is in. So if I click on sketch 2 and then click a second time, and you really have to wait a second in order to do that. It's not a double click. It's a click, wait, and a second click. You can see now that I can rename that sketch. And I'm going to do the same here. Click once, click a second time, and I'm just going to give it a stupid name of first sketch. But the more descriptive you are, the better. Now, another way to see what's going on is if I know these are both sketches, I can kind of right click and edit that particular sketch, and it's going to edit the one that I clicked on. So that's naming a sketch. And one of the conventions I use is, since there are a lot of folders and other things that are automatically generated by Fusion for you, I like to use all caps, because then I can see, oh, this is something that I renamed as opposed to something that Fusion automatically created. That just helps me stay organized a little better. Okay, so one of the things, we know that we have timelines down here, but a sketch itself does not have a timeline. So I can't, when I right click on this and edit this sketch, I don't have the ability to play a timeline back and forth if I had multiple things here and edit that. If you want to, change something, you may have to delete portion of your sketch and add new things into your sketch. That's all well and good, but there is no timeline itself inside a sketch. So that's important to know. And beware of this, that when you do sketch geometry, and this threw me for a while, I could go in here, let me do another rectangle. So one way of repeating the last command you did is right click, and it's not there, sorry. Let me create, oh, I'm not in a sketch, okay, that's why. So I'm gonna click on this. This is the sketch I want. So I'm going to show you another way to edit it. I will just simply double click on that little sketch icon in the browser. So now if I right click, I still don't have that rectangle. All right, I'm going to go up to create and pick 2-point rectangle. And I'm going to draw a rectangle right over the top of this existing rectangle. Okay. Now, what I want to say here is that if you do that, there's actually 2 sets of those rectangles there. This is not something I realized at first. So I'm going to press Escape because I'm currently in the rectangle tool. Now I'm back in selection. If I double click, let's see. If I double click on that rectangle and press delete, you see there's still geometry there. If I double click on that, I delete, then it's actually gone. So if you're drawing on top of other geometry, beware that the first set of geometry is not combined with the second set. It remains unique. All right, let's talk about unwanted sketches, and let's talk about pre-selecting. So I'm going to extrude this. I'm going to hit E for extrude, and extrude this circle up and make a cylinder body. Here's my body here. I'm going to turn on the other body we have. So we have a couple of bodies in here. And basically what I want to do is, let's say I wanted to create a sketch here. But for some reason, I have selected the top of this rectangle doing some other work, but I intend to draw my sketch up here. So I go up to create sketch, and guess what? My sketch is automatically right here. I'm going to redo that and show you a little better example. Let's say I selected the side of this cube, and I'm doing some work on the side of the cube. And then I realize, oh, I want to create a sketch on the top of this cylinder. So I go to create sketch, and now it's down to the side here. Because I had something pre-selected when I hit the create sketch button. So that throws me a lot. And so I suggest that you beware if you've got something selected before you want to create a sketch. Generally, I would just click outside of all geometry. So that's a safe way of unselecting anything you might have selected. Then create a sketch, then select your surface. Then you're going to be oriented to that surface. And again, if I orbit, so I'm holding down my shift key and holding down my middle mouse button to orbit away. If I ever want to look at that straight on at that sketch plane, I can come over here and do a look at, and Fusion is going to orbit to show you a straight on view of your sketch plane. Okay, so let's say you got in that situation where you have something selected, and this will happen to you, and you want to create a sketch here, and now you know, I'm not in the right plane. So I can't start sketching here because the 2D drawing is going to be in this plane, not up in this plane, which is where I wanted it. So if you hit escape, for some reason, you don't get out of the sketch. You would think that escape would take you out. And you can finish the sketch. That's one way. But you've actually created an empty sketch here. And in fact, I've created a bunch of empty sketches, which is not a good idea because you'll come back in the future and say, well, what's in this sketch? What's this all about? And you double click and nothing happens and you don't know what's in there. So a better way of doing that is if you are pre-selected somewhere, you create a sketch, you want to create a sketch on the top of the cylinder, and you are now in an unwanted plane. What I do, and you see there's a new sketch created here, sketch 7. What I do to get out of that is do Control Z back to the point where that new sketch is gone in my browser. So it may have taken me a little while to realize that. Let's improperly select this plane again because we want to draw here. So if I get in my sketch and for some reason I think I'm drawing over here, and I get a rectangle tool by pressing R and I start drawing here, and for some reason now it's drawing vertical. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, what's happening here? And then I realize, oh, I'm on the wrong plane. Okay, so now if I do Control Z, another Control Z, a third Control Z, then I undid the sketch geometry and I got out of the sketch. So sometimes it takes multiple undos to get out of that situation. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more detail on the browser over here. So I've opened up a cabinet that I modeled and built recently. This is based on an article that was in Fine Woodworking. Very cool cabinets if you haven't seen that. Shop grade cabinets with pretty modular system. So I built a very small version of that, and that's what we have on the screen right now. So getting into more specifics of the browser. First of all, this browser window width can be manipulated up here. So if you get into a situation where you've opened up the browser and some of your text is truncated, you can just drag this window to the right to see more detail here. But this is basically a tree structure. And what we've got here is a series of components within this model. If I just click on each one of these, you'll see it's getting kind of blue highlighted. And any of these, I can click here on this triangle to the left and open it up. And within there, you're going to have a series of folders. You'll always have an origin for a component. Usually you'll have bodies for a component, and most likely sketches as well. And so each of these folders can be, I can hide all of the things in a folder if there are multiple, or I can open up the folder and hide individual ones and then collapse it back. So you can see if I was to open up all of this, all of these folders, we'd have a very long browser. And I can scroll that either spinning my mouse wheel, or this is a scroll bar for the browser. So I can go up and down by doing that. Okay, so one of the things is I like to keep my browser very tidy. Once I'm done with some detail within a component, I like to close it up so that I, don't get lost where I am. But this fisheye to the right is the activation control. So generally to start, your entire model is activated, and you can see the entire model without any shading going on. If I go to one of these components and activate that component, it gets an initial blue highlight. But if I click off of it, you'll see that that component, which is the side of the cabinet, the left side, is displayed normally, and everything else is dimmed. So if I do that with another, you'll see that it's selected now, but it's also activated. So if I click off of it, it's no longer selected, but it's still activated, meaning that it's shown in its normal display settings. Everything else is dimmed out. Okay, so let's talk about finding items in the browser. So I'm going to go back and activate my top level component, so I can see all of my bodies, all of my 3D bodies within the model. Now let's say I want to find this bottom piece. I can either rely on my naming of these components, which I'll get into in a second, or I can just click here. And when I do, you'll see that there's a kind of a squiggled underline underneath the component that I have highlighted here. That means that is the bottom component. If I do that on the right side, you'll see that the right side is highlighted. If I do that on a drawer front, you'll see that the middle drawer is highlighted. So that's how you find things that are in the model. There's also, I can right click on it and say find in browser. And now that does a little bit more. That has opened up this top component, opened up the bodies folder within the top component, and has done a squiggle line underneath the particular body that I clicked on. So if I click on this piece of masonite right here, which is the bottom of the top drawer, I right click on that and I say find in browser. Now let's see what happened. I'm not seeing that. Let me try that again. I'm gonna click on this, right click, find in browser. Okay, I guess I didn't click on it. So my top drawer folder, my top drawer component opened up, and within there I've actually got components. So this is an instance where I say, okay, I may want to hide this drawer altogether, okay, which I'm doing right now. But that drawer is also composed of a series of components. And if I turn those on and off, you can see there's the bottom, there's the front. I can individually turn those on and off. Okay, so now you can see things are getting a little complex here. Let's say I just want to look at the top drawer and then see the individual components within it. I can right click on this top drawer component and go down to isolate. Now what isolate did was it simply hid everything else besides this top level component. And so now that's all we see. And as I go down here, if I click on things in the browser, you can see it's highlighting it in the window. There's my bottom. I'm going to collapse this. So now I'm seeing, okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 components within the top drawer component. So I've got a nested component essentially. And you can see as I select each one by clicking on it here, it's highlighting it in the window. Now, what's the difference between me selecting it here and activating it right here? Well, the big difference is when you activate something, when I create new things, such as a sketch. So I'm going to open this up so we can see what's happening here. So I have activated the bottom of the top drawer, and I'm going to click on a new sketch. And I'm just going to say, let's just sketch something on this face. I'm just going to sketch a circle here on that face and click on Finish Sketch. Okay, now the sketch got automatically hidden, but if I go to my Sketches folder and turn that on, you can see I've got a couple of sketches going here. And this is the one that we just created, so I can hide and show that. So what I was trying to say about activation is whatever component is activated, that's where your new sketches or new bodies, whatever you're creating will go into that particular component that is activated. If I was to, I'm going to actually undo that. And I'll do the same sketch without activating. Okay, so I've undone all of that. I'm going to do the same sketch without activating this component. I will go up to the top level component, activate that. And now we should be able to see everything. Well, remember we had isolated this drawer. So unisolating the drawer, I can go back to this drawer, right click and say unisolate. Another way I could have done that is to go to the top level component and show all components. So isolating just simply is a shortcut to you individually hiding all of the other components. No difference really. Okay, so now I've activated the top level component. And if I was to make a new sketch now, I will select that same surface to sketch on. I will press C for circle, which is the shortcut for circle, and just make a big old circle. Click on Finish Sketch. Now this one is showing. Now, where is this in this browser? Well, if we want to know, we can right click on it and find in browser. And there it's blue highlighted. So it's in a Sketches folder. I'm going to collapse that folder, but it's in this folder right here, directly underneath the main level component. It's not inside any of these other components. And it got there because I had activated this top level. So we'll get into a methodology that I use, which is basically make everything into a component and make sure that component is activated while you're working on other things within that component when we do our examples for your assignments. Okay, so let me check my notes to see where we're at here. So we know how to hide and show different items. We know how to activate. We know the difference between selecting and activating. We've done isolation, we've found in the browser. Okay, so the last thing to talk about is tidiness of the browser. If you leave these folders open like this, at least I do, you'll quickly kind of lose track of where you're at. So if I'm done working on something, I will make a point of collapsing it down. And before I collapse it down, I will generally say, are there any sketches here that I really don't want to see? I mean, sketches really exist for the purpose of creating these 3D bodies. And after you've created it, you don't necessarily have to see this sketch. So before I collapse something like this folder, I will generally either turn all of the stuff in that folder off here, or sometimes turn individual things off. Either way. And then collapse. Okay. So that is basically how to manipulate the browser and find things in the browser. Next, I want to get into bodies versus components. So we have seen that when we create a sketch, I'm going to make a rectangle and I'm going to quickly extrude it by pressing the E key. And if I click on OK here, I have created a body. That body appears in the bodies folder underneath the top level model. I can hide and show the body. One thing I can't do is actually just move it on the screen by clicking on it. Okay. Now alternatively, I can create a component, which I will do here by clicking on this icon. And I'm going to call this block. And now I see a new line in my browser here with a square icon next to it. The body's icon is a little bit rounded. And if I open up this folder, there's an origin in here, which I can show, but nothing else. So I've created essentially a placeholder for things to go into, which is what you can think of a component as. So now with this component activated, and this fisheye is showing that it is the active component, when I create a sketch, I'll create it on this front plane. I'm going to make another rectangle and I'm going to finish my sketch. You can see now that within my block component there is a new sketches folder and it has sketch number 1, and if I hide that or show that, I can see that's the sketch that I just made. So now if I hit E for extrude and I extrude that sketch back and click on OK, I'll also see a bodies folder in here and I can turn bodies on and off. So now I have this concept of a protected element in here that I can turn the whole thing on and off, all of its sketches, all of its bodies, whatever the components are. And another thing I can do is actually move this on the screen. So I can take my cursor and just move this around, whereas this body here I'm not able to move. But the most important reason that I think for doing individual pieces of wood in separate components, which is what I would suggest doing, is that it gives you a shorter timeline. So here is a cabinet that I modeled and built recently, and you can see that if we activate the top level component, I've got a very long timeline here. But if I activate, let's say the top, I've got a relatively short timeline. So this component approach allows you to work on stuff much easier with shorter timelines. The second thing it allows you to do is nest things. So if I activate this middle drawer, and I'm going to right click on it and isolate it. There we go. So now I'm seeing only the middle drawer component, but within that middle drawer I have 5 different components: the bottom, the front, the sides, the back, etc. So the second advantage of putting things in components is that I can nest things, and for instance I can turn this entire drawer on and off. If I want to see another drawer here, let's see, what else do I have? On this same level, I can turn on this bottom drawer. I can turn on the top drawer. And if I click here in the top level component, I'm seeing just the drawers now. So that's another reason for using components. All right, next up we'll get into a little bit of manipulation of this timeline. So I said earlier that the timeline will change based on what component is active with this fisheye. And if you activate the top level component, you are getting the timeline for the entire model. And you can see I'm scrubbing this scroll bar to the left and to the right. You can see it's quite long. If I go to any one of these individual components and activate that, you can see the timeline gets much shorter and much more manageable. So basically, this is the timeline of all of the sketches and features involved in making just this component. So when you're doing timeline manipulation, you can see if I go to any one of these components, I have something that's manageable here versus the top level, which is in a complicated model, an absolute nightmare to deal with. So this is a great reason just by itself for making everything into components, which I tried to do. Okay, so let's see what these buttons do. Basically, these are, this is a play button. This is a step forward, step backwards. This is go to the end and go to the beginning. So if I scrub this scroll bar all the way to the end, you'll see I have a vertical bar, and that's indicating where we currently are in the timeline. So basically we're at the end of it. If I hit this button, now you can see all of this stuff on the timeline is grayed out, and look at nothing's here inside the model. So if I step forward one step at a time, you can see here's something. This is actually a component getting created. So each one of these little icons in the timeline means something. And if I hover over it, I get a name. It says L side 1, which is the name of the component that I made. And it's saying what its parent is right below that, which is the entire upper level model. So if I go one step at a time, I can see, okay, here's a sketch that was created. If I open up this component within the timeline and show my sketches, there is the sketch. So it's a little funky as you go through this timeline. You may not see things happening. And if that's the case, it's generally a sketch or some other body or construction plane that's been hidden. Okay, so the third item here is an extrude. So I'm just stepping through, and you can see things happening either on the screen. There's a dado being cut, or you can see, you will always see effects here in the timeline. This was a mirroring command that I'll get into, but you can see this component was made, and then an exact mirrored copy of it was made on the other side of the screen. So that's what these buttons do. They let you step forward and backward. Let's go back to the beginning, and I'll actually hit the play button, and now we can watch an animation essentially of this entire model getting made, which I think is pretty cool. The only time you're not seeing things happen again is if in the browser, whatever was being made is set to being invisible, then it won't show up here. And this green bar down here is moving to indicate where this playback is within this entire timeline. Okay, so that is the timeline. I'm going to stop the playing here by clicking on the square button. And let's go to the end. And let's go to one particular, let's go to the left side. Okay. So I have activated the left side, which means the timeline is just showing what happens in the left side. So let me show you briefly the power of this. Um, let's say I wanted to extrude these sides to a different thickness. Right now I've got probably 3/4 of an inch. If I go back here, I can just scrub this back, let go of it, and you'll see potentially see changes on the screen. So far, it's still our component is still visible. Now, if I go back before this extrude and back to this extrude, now it's just a sketch. Okay, so if I go past a feature, I'm able to right click on it and actually edit the feature. And here I can see that it's an extrude. It shows the profiles that were selected. So basically I selected 3 different parts of this sketch and I pulled it in this direction. And actually I'm using a parameter here, which we'll get to, but I set up a parameter for the plywood thickness. But let me change that distance, and I'm going to change that distance to 1 for 1 inch. Okay, now this piece got thicker. Okay, now as I scrub this timeline, you can see that the dados are still being cut here, and everything appears to be the same as it was, except for this side is now thicker. So I didn't have to undo the model to go back and make a change way back towards the beginning of what I was creating here. I can manipulate the timeline, edit the feature, and essentially that is what parametric modeling is all about. Okay, there will be problems sometimes when you go back and make changes. You will see either a yellow highlight or, let's see if we have one here. If we go to the full timeline here, let's see if I created any problems by changing that extrusion. We're kind of getting deep in the woods of timeline, but I did want to give you a little bit of exposure. So here's a warning basically that was created when I made those changes. You can see this bottom shelf is all screwed up now because obviously I was maybe doing an extrusion based on the fact that this was 3/4 of an inch. I'd have to go back and examine exactly what happened. So I am going to undo that so that my side goes back to 3/4 of an inch. Okay, but I just wanted to show you in a complex model, once you get a little bit more familiar with all of these things, you will be able to do, not just undo a bunch of steps to change something, you'll be able to go back and change it anywhere within this timeline. Okay, so that is, and another thing is, you'll be able to delete things. You can say, I want to delete this feature altogether. Now, sometimes when you do that, all hell breaks loose, because if I was to delete the sketch, let me go ahead and do it here, and it gives me a warning. You sure you want to do this? Because you're about to screw things up. The extrusion is now warning that I don't know where that sketch is. You deleted that sketch. And it basically has a cache of old sketches, so it was able to render this. But anytime you get yellow highlight, or even worse, a red highlight, which is an overall error, you have to go in and fix it. So we will get into more detail on manipulating the timeline, but I kind of wanted to give you an overview of why it's there, how to play back, how to go back in time and make some changes if you need to. Okay, so one of the things that's very important in a design program is verifying your measurements. One of the things I think SketchUp is actually a lot easier in than Fusion is to verify your measurements, but obviously there is a way to do it in Fusion. I'm just undoing a few things that I screwed up here. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's let's look at this model and measure some things. If I want to measure this piece, there's a couple of ways to do it. The easiest way is if I just click on an edge, in the lower right corner, I see one edge, length 14 inches. If I click on this edge, I see 18 inches, which is very handy. If I click on this edge, I see 0.75, 3/4 of an inch. Okay, if it's a little more complicated than an edge, if I want to, for instance, what's the opening in this cabinet? And the reason we're seeing something a little screwy here is this is a sketch. I'm going to right click on it, find it in my browser, and hide it, and then tidy up my browser by collapsing that folder. Okay, so now we don't see any sketches. We're seeing the 3D model. So let's say I want to verify what's this opening in my cabinet. I'm going to go to the Inspect menu. I can either click on this, which is Measure, which I is the shortcut key. So I can either click there, or click here, or simply press I. And that's what that I is in the menu. Okay, so I'm in Measure right now, and I can click on an edge, for instance, and I get a little 1 symbol here. If I move over to another edge, I get a 2 symbol, and I get 9 inches up here. Now, I can, without doing anything, if I click on another edge, the 2 moves over here. So the initial click stays, and I can change the second click. So now it's 9 3/4 from the inside of this left-hand piece to the right side of the outside of the right side. If I want to measure, say, from here to here, I can either close this and get back in, or I can click on this restart. I'm going to just restart, and I'm going to click on this edge, and now up here I'm seeing 10.5 inches from outside to outside on the cabinet. Okay, so that's a quick introduction on how to measure. Let's look at selection now. So I'm going to close down this feature dialog box. Remember that these things have to be closed. If you start doing something and nothing happens, the first thing to look at is, do I have one of these feature dialog boxes open? So I'm going to close that, and we're going to look at selection. So I can just click on something, and I have selected a face down here. Another way of doing selection is to actually drag through. Let's say I wanted to select all of these components. I drag through going from left to right. So basically anything that I totally intersect is now selected. If I go from right to left, and if you're a SketchUp user, you probably know this, it's the same in SketchUp. This is just anything that I touch. So if I just touch this right side component, I have selected the component. Okay, if I had done the same thing here, going from left to right, it doesn't select anything because I haven't surrounded anything in its entirety. I have to surround this entire piece going from left to right to get a selection. But if I go from right to left, it's anything I intersect. So sometimes right to left selection is a lot easier to deal with. Okay, and the last thing we haven't looked at, and I've got some default appearances set up in my system, so everything I draw turns into wood automatically. But you probably don't have that yet if you first start out in Fusion. So if I go to a new folder, I'm going to hit A for appearance. And let's see if I can go to a more basic appearance here. I'm not really sure what the default appearance is. Let's see if I type in default, if I get something. Well, let me just drag this out. Now, I know I didn't explain that, so I'm just going to make a body. So I'm going to quickly make a sketch. on this plane. And I'm going to press R for my rectangle tool and do a couple clicks, and then press E for extrude and come up and click. So now I get this red body. I just wanted to very quickly create something that wasn't wood and show you how to change something's appearance. Okay, so appearance, actually not sure where it is in the menus. But I do know that there's a shortcut key. I'm sure it is in these menus somewhere. Let's see, modify maybe? Yes. Appearance is in the modify menu, which makes sense. Okay, so you can either press A or go to this modify item within the appearance item in the modify menu. And now you're going to get this feature dialog box that pops up. And you can either search for things in here. For instance, if I search for MDF, I'm scrolling down here, I get MDF board. So I can drag this and release it on top of a body. I'll do a Control Z to undo this. Or I can go over to my browser. This is the body that we have on the screen. So I'm just hiding and showing it to verify that. Now if I hit A for appearance, I can drag this MDF board onto the body. Oops, I guess I should undo that. Let me go back. I'm going to drag this red onto that body. So now if I wanted to make this MDF, you'll see in my appearance dialog box, I have what's in this design, the various surfaces. So I guess this is probably what you would see, this matte surface. Let's see if I drag that to the body. For some reason that's not changing. But anyway, so how do you get various woods? So if we scroll down here, you'll see that each one of these is a folder. Keep in mind that you've got, this is a little weird here, you've got two scroll bars. You've got this scroll bar for the entire dialog box. And then within this Fusion 360 Appearances, you have another scroll bar. And I have often lost my 3D wood effects. It's like, I know there's another wood folder. Where the hell is it? Well, this scroll bar will let you, well, in combination of the two, get down to wood solid. So what's the difference between wood and wood solid? If I open up wood and I drag this onto this body, you will see a wood surface on here, but I'm not seeing any end grain. I'm basically seeing the same surface on all sides of the body, which is what SketchUp does. Fusion has 3D appearances, which I use all the time. So if I go down to wood solid, open that folder, and again, I've got to get my scroll bar to go down here. I've got unfinished, finished, painted, stained. So I'll go to unfinished, scroll down, and these are all 3D woods. Now, if you see something that's got a little down arrow next to it, let's say we want ash, I'm going to click on that, and now it is downloaded to your system. And now I can drag that onto my body, and I should get an ash effect. If it hasn't downloaded yet, let's see if I try to drag mahogany, nothing's going to happen. Okay, so if you drag a material, nothing happens, make sure you look over here and see if you need to download it to your system first. Okay, so I dragged ash out here, and now let's see what happened. I've got end grain, and I've got side grain, and I've got top grain. To me, this is almost good enough reason to switch from SketchUp to Fusion. It's fabulous. Now let me close this and show you that if you're really particular about the look of your wood, let's say you've got quarter sawn wood. I can right click here and I can go to my texture map controls, and I can use these arrow keys to actually move this end grain so that I've got quarter sawn, and I can rotate this too. So you have a tremendous amount of flexibility as to, you know, what your piece of wood looks like, which I think is just fabulous. Okay, so that is appearances. There's one other thing that's sort of related to appearances. I'm going to go back and open up a complicated design to show you that. I'll go to that workbench that I showed before. If I open that up, and by the way, these all of the models that I reference in the videos, I will put in your folder so that you can have access to them. Okay, so I have in this Rubo workbench, I've set cherry for this tool holder, and the rest of it I think was birch, which is actually what I built it out of. And this end block was also cherry. So I wanted to show you that you can also show components by color, which is useful in a couple of different ways. So if I go to Inspect and Component Color Cycling Toggle, now I see a bunch of colors, and those colors correspond to different components. So it makes it really easy to find components, you know, in the browser. It makes it easy to find components in the timeline, because now when I get into this mode, everything is color coordinated between the browser, the timeline, and the model. But obviously it's not very realistic looking. So I can, without changing the appearance, I can override that and go to this color cycling mode. So I'm going to go back to Inspect and go back and turn my actual colors on. One thing I forgot to say about appearances is there's a way to set your default appearance so that anytime you're creating something, like in our case, you probably want it to look like wood. So I'm going to go up to my preferences. I'm going to click on, I've got a picture here, but yours might be your initials, upper right corner. I'm going to select preferences. And when that pops up, I'm going to go to, where is it? Material. On the material screen, material library is Fusion. Physical material, which we didn't get into, but that's not really important unless you do stress analysis or things like that. You can set that to wood if you want. But the physical material name is what you want. And I'm going to actually leave that mine as maple, but you can pick any of the woods here. And so the next time you create something, it'll automatically be set to that. And I think you may have to go down here also and select wood, solid, unfinished, and then you'll probably get these selections here above as far as your physical material name. Oh, I guess that's, yeah, I don't know what that is. I'm sorry. What you should be doing here is setting this to wood, solid, unfinished if you want, or whatever, and then pick one of the 3Ds. And these are going to be choices from the appearances that you have previously downloaded. So let me change mine to cherry. I apply, go to OK. And then if I create a new document, I'm going to create a sketch on this plane. I'm going to hit R for rectangle, make a quick and dirty sketch, hit E for extrude, pull this up, and now my new body is automatically cherry, and it is coming in 3D. So if I right click and go to my texture control map, you can see that I can, you know, center the pith, for instance, or even scale the material. Okay, that's all. Next, I want to get into moving and aligning and also copying. So I've got the basement office shelves open here. I'll just orbit around in the model so you can see what it's all about. And in the browser, I have a number of components. And if I hide a component, you can see this is a large shelf. This is another large shelf, vertical divider. And this is a small horizontal shelf, and there's a small divider. So I have 6 different components. Let's say I want to move one of those shelves around. So I can go to Modify, Move, Copy, but most often I would just hit the M key. So if I hit M, I'm presented with a dialog box now, and it has different selections here: components, bodies, faces, and sketch objects. Let me pick faces first because it's generally you don't want to do this. If you've got a component here that's not open for editing and you try to move a face, you can see that you get basically you're changing the 3D object. I can actually use this rotation thing, and I'm horribly changing that shelf material. Generally not what you want to do. There's other ways to do, fancier bodies like this, and you wouldn't move a face. So that's an object type that you probably don't want to move. So I'm gonna Control Z out of that. Now let's talk about moving components. So any of these are components, and you'll see if I click on one of these, hovering over it, I get this triad, which allows me to move, rotate the object. So I'm going to click there, and by doing so, I set essentially a pivot point. So now when I'm moving from that point, and I'm just dragging in a direction, and I can move in either direction. And you can see that your distance here is updated by your last move. The same thing, this window is showing your distance there. And if I just do an OK, you'll see that there's a couple of new tools here on the screen. One of them says capture position, and the other says revert. So if I click on revert, the component goes back to its original position. So let me do that again. I'm going to click M for move. I'm going to click here, move this component horizontally, do an OK, and now if I click on revert, it's actually going to stay there. Okay, I'm actually going to undo that. And I also want to show you that components can be moved simply by just dragging them. We'll get into grounding at some point, which prevents you from doing this. But if it's a component, you can simply move it around on the screen. Now, a component, as we learned earlier, can exist with several bodies. For instance, let's revert back to a shelf that looks like a shelf. Let's say we wanted to put something on this shelf and make it part of that component. A book or something to be on that shelf. I would first go to the shelf and activate it. So I'm actually activating this shelf. And now when I create a sketch, I'm creating a sketch inside that component. So if I open up the shelf folder, when I start drawing on this surface, and I go C for circle, and then extrude this up by pressing E. What I'm trying to do here is show you that I'm creating a second body inside. Well, I actually need to do a new body here inside the component. So now getting back to move, when we do an M for move, I can, instead of selecting components, I can say, I want to move the body. And now when I click on this, I'm sliding the body inside of this component. So nothing else is moving except for the cylinder that I put on the shelf. So if I want to move it over here, I can do that. Now, if I simply click on this body, on this cylinder, you can see it doesn't move, but the component itself moves. So you can't move bodies by simply dragging them in 3D space, but you can move components by doing that. So that's yet another reason why if you're going to create something, I always make it into a component. I'm just undoing a little bit here. So that you can easily move it and you don't have to get into this move command. But the move command, if you do get into the dialog box with nothing selected, and let's say we decide we want to move a component, there are several movement types. The first one is free move, which it defaults to. So again, if I click on something, I've got this triad, I can move it in any direction. And I can also use these surfaces to move free form within here, outside of the X, Y, and Z plane. I can rotate in this axis. I can rotate in this axis. So you see, free move will allow you to do all of that stuff. Okay. And I'm going to get out and say, okay, so that's going to be in a new position. Now let's say I didn't do this revert. And let's say I want to reposition this shelf. I hit M. Component is good. I want to select my component now. So I'm going to select that. And I start moving this guy. And I hit OK. It's going to continue to allow me to move these components. But if I try to do something else, like an extrude, for instance, I'm going to get this dialog box, which you will run into, that says some components have been moved, capture the current position, or continue in the previous position. So if I click capture, it's just like doing this button, where it's going to capture the position. If I do continue, it's going to revert back to the original position. So that's the dreaded capture position dialog box. It simply means you've moved something and you haven't finalized its position. It can be reverted. A lot of times, like in woodworking, you want to see, well, what's the joinery here? Well, oops, let me undo. Okay, so what's the joinery here? Well, one way of looking at that is I just take that component, move it out of the way. Oh, I see that it's a slot. Okay. Now I can revert and put it right back. So that's the reason why you would want to move something and not actually keep its new position. Okay. If I want to move something accurately, let's say I wanted to move this shelf down to the top of this shelf. How would you go about doing that? So I'm going to press M for move. I'm in component mode, so I'm going to select my component. And I've got a choice of where to grab this from. And that really does matter in this case. I'm going to grab it basically anywhere on this bottom surface. Okay. So now when I start to move this down arrow, I can just click on this surface and it will go all the way down there flush. But if I had M for move, select my component. If I had grabbed the top, my pivot point is on the top of this. If I start coming down here and I select this surface, the two tops are aligned. So it really does matter where you put that pivot point if you're going to do this type of movement where you simply click on a surface to essentially align the component with another component. Okay. So let's say we wanted to rotate one of these guys. It depends on where this pivot point is. So if I hit M for move again, and I select this component, let's say I'm not paying attention, I just click there, and I kind of arbitrarily set my pivot point. That's exactly where it's going to pivot from. So I'm going to do a Control Z to go back, another M to get a move. This time, I'm going to say, okay, I want to set my pivot point. And I come in here and say, I want to rotate this right from this point right here. Okay, great. Now I start rotating and look what happens. Well, in that case, that worked. I'm a little surprised because what I was going to say is there's a set pivot checkbox that normally you have to check um, before you can use the pivot itself. And it's kind of frustrating that it doesn't do most of the time what it just did. It automatically finalized the pivot point and lets you use it. But just be aware, generally when you're using pivot, like if I want to change the pivot right now and say to over here, I'm going to click on, well, I'm going to click on this to set the pivot. I'm going to put it here. Now, there's a little green check mark that I have not clicked on. And when I do this, I'm actually rotating the pivot point instead of the board. So just beware that if that happens, you may have screwed up your pivot point, but if it's still in a good position, you can just click there to check. And now you're rotating your board using that pivot point. So that's the pivot point. Another handy way of moving things is point to point. So if I hit M for move, I'm in my component mode. I'm going to select this component, and now I'm going to go to point to point. So now it's saying pick an origin point. So I'm going to say I want to pick this point here, and then the blue highlight is here on target point, and I'm going to pick this point. And now the two shelves are aligned because I did a point-to-point move. And then if I do OK, I have my capture position or revert. I'm going to revert in this case. So that's how to do that. The difference between free move, I did another M, and translate is pretty subtle. If I do a translate, I can pick and I can only move this X, Y, or Z. So it's kind of a safer way of moving things. The free move allows you to do rotations on two different planes. It allows you to move freely in 3D space, and it allows you to translate. So it's got everything built into it. Okay, so that's the basics of move copy. And if you knew ahead of time, it's like, I really want to be here, I want to capture this position, you can click on that capture position check mark, and now you're not pestered with these icons to capture or revert. I'm going to Control Z my way back out of there. Hopefully, do not know why that's not Control Zing. All right. Oh, there we go. It's just taking a while. Okay, there we go. All right, so that's the basics of move. Copy is also in the move command. So you see if I hit M and I select a component, that there is a create copy check mark, which I can check. And now when I drag this shelf, I'm creating a copy of it. Okay. Then if I click OK, there's another component. And what happened is over in this tree, if we click here, we can see here is, with the blue underline, the new component. And it's a exact copy of the first component. That's why there's a 2 after here. So it's a small shelf :2. This was small shelf :1, which I created a copy of. I generally don't do copies that way. I find that a little bit confusing. So let's undo that. If I'm going to copy something, I would select the component I want, which I can do in the browser, or I can click in the model, do a right click, do a copy, or do a Control C, same thing. Now, when I do a paste, Control V or right click paste, I want to be in the component that I want to put it in. So if the top level component is activated, it's got the fisheye, that new component, when I do a Control V, is going to be in this same hierarchy in the tree. So if I move this and click OK, I've got another shelf here. That's what I just created, what I'm hiding down here in the browser. So I'll undo that. Let's say I wanted to put all the another shelf inside this component itself. So now if I click on this, I'm going to do a copy. I'm going to activate this new component over here. Let me show it also and open it up so you can see what happens here. If I right click and do a paste, where's paste? I guess I didn't do a copy. Let me do the copy first. Right click and let me do it this way. I'm going to right click on this component itself and do a copy. Now, this is an activated component. So when I do a paste, it's going to go inside that active component. So when I do my paste, where is my paste? I guess what I have to do is activate the top level component. Then, without activating this, do a copy. Now I'm going to come down and activate this component. I want to put it inside here. So I can right click and do a paste. Let me see if I can do a Control V. What's happening? Not sure. Going to stop the recording.